Hey everybody, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Agenda, and this is the history of the world. It's now 1700 BCE. In the last century, we saw the Middle Kingdom of Egypt more or less collapse. Mesopotamia was briefly united by the great King Hammurabi, only to collapse back into a number of small feuding states not long after his death. And those areas aside, agriculture still slowly advancing across the world, and civilization with it, expanding. China almost certainly has some kind of organized state of its own by now. Unfortunately, our knowledge of them is limited by a lack of any kind of writing from this period. And the Greek mainland is also becoming home to a still small but slowly growing civilization. Now, within the Mesopotamian heartland, Babylon is almost certainly still the strongest power under the rule of King Abi-Isha, but doesn't come close to unifying it anymore. Other major powers include the Sealand dynasty close to the Persian Gulf in the south, although that area is increasingly depopulated due to over 1,000 years of salt buildup, salinization, which has made the ground increasingly difficult to farm. There's also Assyria to the north, and Elam to the east, among other smaller powers, and the increasingly intrusive nomadic Kassites are a thorn in everyone's side during this period. Plus, there are new powers rising to the north in Anatolia, but we'll get to them shortly. Abi-Esha himself rules for another 16 years after the turn of the century, and concludes his nearly 30-year reign with his death in 1684 BCE. His successor Ammi-Ditana rules a surprisingly stable and peaceful city, now the religious center of Mesopotamia and still one of the largest cities in the world for over 40 years thereafter. Meanwhile, in Assyria, Adasi dies, the last of a series of short-lived kings amid a bit of a civil war that they had after attaining independence from Babylon, and is succeeded by Belbani, who officially founds the Adaside dynasty, although obviously it's named after Adasi, but in any case, the dynasty will prove pretty stable and long-lasting. I'm not going to go through every king they have during this century. There's 7 this century alone, and Assyria is still a pretty fringe player. But the Adasides will remain on the throne through the century and for quite some time thereafter. But the big change of the century in this region is not in Mesopotamia to itself, but to the north in Anatolia. Around 1650, the numerous tribes of the Hittite people in Anatolia are unified under the rule of Hattusili I by a series of successful military campaigns. He campaigns south as far as Syria and the upper Euphrates, carves out a powerful new kingdom in what was not centrally organized territory before, but now becomes a powerful empire based in Hattusa. Now it immediately begins to suffer from infighting between Hattusili's sons, but on his deathbed in 1620, Hattusili pulls off a bit of a masterstroke. Disgusted, he disinherits every one of his sons and names his grandson Mursili I as heir. You would assume his sons oppose this, but apparently they don't manage to achieve anything because Mursili keeps the throne, must keep his uncles in line or crush them, and he's maybe not even an adult when he takes the throne, but after a decade or so of stabilization, he takes up the legacy of his grandfather. And he campaigns further south, conquers the kingdom of Yamhad and the city of Aleppo in Syria. And by the turn of the century, Mursili I rules a impressively powerful, flourishing young new empire, and is considering a great campaign down the Euphrates to the rich lands of Mesopotamia proper. And with how powerful the Hittites have become, there may be little to stand in his way. There is also another major group of tribes, the Mitanni, further east in Anatolia, or possibly far southern Mesopotamia, basically near the source of the Tigris, which you can also see on this map pretty easily. That's the further east of the 2 great rivers in the southeast. But the Mitanni have yet to achieve the unity and military strength that the Hittites now have. Meanwhile, back in Mesopotamia, Ammi-Ditana dies in about 1640 after 40 years on the throne and is succeeded by Ammi-Saduqa, who also has a peaceful reign focused on construction of temples and other building projects, and is succeeded by Samsu-Ditana, who continues that peaceful example. It might be forced at this point. The state administration of Babylon is steadily decaying. Many of the bureaucratic offices have become hereditary, corruption is rife, and that very bureaucracy is extremely bloated aside from that. But by the turn of the century, Babylon is still holding the Kassites in check. It hasn't been able to reconquer the Sealand dynasty, which is pretty weak, but hasn't lost any ground either. And Elam and Assyria have remained mostly stable and inactive. Almost certainly there were some minor conflicts, but no huge territorial changes or anything during this period. So it's been a pretty peaceful century, really, with no major upheaval in Mesopotamia. But Babylon is very much in decline. The bureaucracy, bloated, corrupt, the military, relatively weak. And as the Hittites to the north turn their gaze on Mesopotamia, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot to stop them. Incidentally, what you're looking at here is a tablet made during Ammi-Saduqa's reign, which records the positions of Venus. And this tablet has actually been invaluable to dating this entire period, as the positions are pretty accurate, although it's also been open to interpretation enough to allow several different chronologies for this whole period, unfortunately. Meanwhile, Egypt, still divided. The newly ascended Menefer-I of the 13th dynasty rules most of the country from Ichtawi, which has replaced Thebes as the capital, although Memphis is also a very important city, but not presently the capital. The 14th dynasty, probably represented at the moment by Merjafare, rules the Nile Delta. Menefer-I is new to the throne, having just taken it in 1701, and he has a long but pretty ineffective reign of 23 years before dying in 1677. His counterparts in the Nile Delta are no more effective, and it seems by this point, by this century, deep in the Second Intermediate period, the entire apparatus of state administration and bureaucracy of Egypt have just totally collapsed and become basically ineffective, such that neither pharaoh is really exercising all that much effective power. Now, Menefer-I is succeeded by Merhotep-Re-Ini, who rules only about 2 years. This is his sigil. Then Sankhenre-Sewajtu, who rules 3 years. Mersekemre-Enid, who rules 3 years. Sewajtkare-Hori, who rules 5 years. Merkare-Sobekotep, who rules 2 years. Several rulers whose names haven't even survived. Merkare-Mentuhotep V, Sehekenre-Sankpteh, probably others. Even the very basic timeline of ruler following ruler is very confused at this point. The state is almost totally broken down. None of them are lasting more than a few years. None of them are leaving significant records behind. And things are not any better in the 14th dynasty, where there is also a succession of unclear and short-reigned pharaohs. Now, it's not a surprise that this mess of ineffective and weak rulers is pretty ripe for conquest, really. Now, there are not that many obvious candidates for such a conquest, of course. The Hittites are rising, but are much too far north to strike Egypt proper at this point. Mesopotamia is weak and divided, and far away as well, really, by the standards of the time. The kingdom of Kush is rising in Nubia to the south of Egypt, but not to such a degree that it threatens to imminently conquer the country. Ultimately, the people that step into this power void are the Hyksos, a people that come from Canaan, several times the subject of Egyptian raiding expeditions in past centuries. That's basically southern Palestine or southern Levant. The Hyksos are now happy to exploit the weakness of the pharaohs, and they may get a benefit from using war chariots, which the Egyptians don't yet possess. Now, Hyksos is actually a generic term used by the Egyptians to describe Asiatic rulers, but it's come to be used pretty distinctly for this group of invaders over the centuries. So in about 1650, the Hyksos sweep across the delta, conquer the 14th dynasty, then turn south and take Memphis, which was briefly once again used as the capital prior to that conquest, and end the 13th dynasty. The city of Avaris in the northeastern delta is built by them in a very defensible position to become the Hyksos capital, and they crown their leader Salites as Pharaoh of Egypt. They do not immediately conquer all of Egypt, though, although they do rule the majority of it, including the city of Memphis. There is at least one native dynasty surviving, the 16th dynasty. Their relation to the 13th dynasty is unclear. They might be an extension or a cadet branch of the 13th dynasty, but they might also just be a local ruler crowning himself down in Thebes. In any case, the 16th dynasty does continue to exist in Thebes in Upper Egypt, and there's also possibly a short-lived dynasty around Abydos over the next few decades, possibly just an indication that a lot of the kingdom is still in a good deal of chaos. In any case, the Abydos dynasty's very existence is quite disputed, as indicated by the fancy question mark on this map. Now, Salitas rules for 20 years, slowly expands his control over Egypt, building his new capital at Avaris, and he's succeeded possibly at some point by Semken and then a Paranat. The most definitely attested eventual successor is Kion, whose legs you see here. Dating is very imprecise, but Kion definitely expands his rule southwards, destroys the Abydos dynasty, and relegates the 16th dynasty to a vassal state, having reached as far south as Thebes. The 16th dynasty, meanwhile, is ruled first by Jehudi for 3 years, then Sobekotep VIII for 16, and then Neferhotep III, who rules for 1 year, which seemingly sees a severe famine, and possibly also is the year in which Thebes is forced to submit to the Hyksos. Mentuhotepi rules for only a year or so himself, and then Nebiru-Ra I, who rules for 26 years, Nebiru-Ra II, who rules for under a year, Semenre, who rules for at most a year, and then Babian, who is poorly attested but is likely just taken power in Thebes as we reach 1600 BCE. The names of all these rulers will not be on the test. They're very irrelevant, frankly, and we barely know anything more about them than their names and ruler times on the throne. And frankly, we aren't actually certain of that for a lot of them, so yeah. The important thing is the dynasties. The 16th dynasty is probably little more than a vassal of the Hyksos 15th dynasty by now, and it also is pretty overshadowed by the rising kingdom of Kush to the south, which is definitely waxing strong, but nonetheless, the 16th dynasty represents the last hopes of Egypt for native rule. The Hyksos, Kion rules for more than a decade, brings them to essentially complete control over Egypt, and is followed by his son Yanasi, and then possibly a Sakirhar. His positioning is quite uncertain. Frankly, the Hyksos records are not much better than the 16th dynasty's records. One of those two, Yanasi or Sakirhar, rules the 15th dynasty at the end of the century, with the 15th dynasty still in position to pretty much dominate Egypt. Now, exact dates in China are still very uncertain, but we have discovered oracle bones from this time period, carvings made into bones asking questions of the spirits, basically, which often reference, conveniently for us, the names of the rulers of the land, which allows us to say with some certainty that about this time, about 1600, the Shang dynasty rises in China. According to the legends, which are probably not entirely accurate, but the only basis we have to go on, a Taiyi, noble ruler and vassal of the existing Xia dynasty, the existence of which is still not even confirmed, rebels due to the corruption and irresponsibility of the court of Ji of Xia, and the Shang prevail following the Battle of Mingtiao, which is fought in a thunderstorm. Most of the Xia army proves unwilling to fight due to the corruption and incompetence of their leader. Taiyi exiles Ji and is crowned as Tang of Shang, or Tang the Perfect. the first verifiable emperor of China. I apologize for mangling all these Chinese pronunciations incidentally. I will do my best with them. The Shang dynasty is seen here more or less in its mature borders, which it probably doesn't have in full yet. It's based along the Yellow River, which of course is the large river in the north of the kingdom there, which it controls much of the length of. It certainly doesn't rule anything like all of modern China, really only a small fraction of its total land mass. Although, at least based on this map, it touches the Yangtze in some places. But they do more or less, seemingly in this time period, complete the process of uniting the small states and cities along the Yellow River, which is probably the heartland of Chinese civilization at this point. And by best estimates, Tang is succeeded by his son Da Ding, then by Taijia, who apparently is temporarily exiled from his own court, but then welcomed back after repenting of his autocratic habits, and then by Bu Bing. Although already the order of these is quite uncertain. By some estimates, Bu Bing is a son of Tang, but the oracle bones do not agree with the traditional histories in some of these cases. And dating of any of this is very uncertain. Frankly, any of those four could set the throne in 1600. In fact, the Shang may not even have actually fully completed their rise just yet. But whether they have or not, what we can say for certain is China is rapidly becoming more united and powerful, and in roughly this ballpark, the Shang dynasty rises up to unite a pretty considerable area of it. Now, I do have a few other notes for this century. In the deserts of the Sinai, we found a few traces of a so-called Proto-Sinatic script. You might better understand the importance of this if I call it by its other name, Early Alphabetic Script. Now, our current best estimate is that this is possibly an attempt by the Canaanites or Hyksos to adopt hieroglyphics to their own language, and the script bears some resemblance to hieroglyphics and also some resemblance to what will quite far in the future become the Phoenician script, which will quite a bit further in the future still become the Latin alphabet. Now, whether these symbols represent at this date already sounds as opposed to words, or how exactly this script works is not really that clear, but it is the earliest known trace of something resembling alphabetic writing. Bigger news, really, in the immediate moment. Bread. An Egyptian baker has accidentally left their bread out in the sun for too long, and possibly spilled some beer on it. This has caused the naturally occurring yeast in the bread to ferment, especially if they spilled some beer on it to add some more yeast. Now, this accident has shockingly caused the resulting bread, once cooked, to become lighter, tastier, and larger than any previous bread. Now, we can't know the exact process of trial and error that follows, but somehow or other, they've figured out how to make this process consistent by adding yeast to their bread, to their dough, either by possibly sourcing it from nearby breweries, or by keeping a dough starter to mix in with new dough, as is still done today by hobbyist sourdough makers. They have obviously no real understanding of microbiology, but they are to some extent able to isolate and use their preferred strains of yeast in this fashion to leaven the bread, essentially a process of artificial selection. And the final result is that, look, bread up to this point has mostly been flat, or at least dense. But now, with the use of yeast to leaven it on an industrial scale, which there's probably a few examples prior to this of bread being leavened, but not necessarily using yeast in this exact fashion. You will see various dates for it, but this seems to be the most confirmed date and records of the use of leavened bread. And so now bread's not flat. You can make it into all kinds of shapes. It rises, and it's a lot tastier, generally. So this is actually a Objectively, assuming we have the dates about right on this, probably the greatest event of the century, really. All of this stuff and nonsense about rulers and dynasties and so on has practically no effect on the life of the common man compared to the rise of leavened bread. Yeast, folks. Yeast. This really transforms human life. Anyway, in less good news, a massive volcanic eruption has destroyed the island of Thera, also called Santorini, or ripped it in half. The resulting tsunami has caused enormous damage on the northern coast of Crete to the Minoan civilization there, and to various other pockets of civilization throughout the Aegean. It does seem that the Minoan civilization will recover, quite quickly actually, but it's not something they'll forget anytime soon. And aside from that, the tsunami, there are possibly torrential storms in Egypt, various climate disruptions, summer frosts and crop failures are reported in China around the time of the rise of the Shang, so there may be a volcanic winter across the world. And this has also been claimed as a later inspiration for Plato's story of Atlantis, although that is, frankly, I'm not going to talk that up. That's highly uncertain at best. But it's a candidate anyway. In any case, this massive eruption definitely causes some climate disruption across the world in the short term, potentially a volcanic winter, which certainly doesn't make things better in Egypt and Mesopotamia. There is famine in Egypt for a good part of this century. And so that will bring us to 1600 BCE. The strongest power in the world is probably now, somewhat abruptly, Shang China. We can say with some confidence that China is now finally more or less unified. Not completely, but a good chunk of it are along the Yellow River. And the imperial system has already come to be with the emperors of the Shang dynasty. Now, whether their predecessors, the Xia, were a true empire or one of numerous regional kingdoms united by the Shang, or maybe just part of a totally fictional backstory, is totally impossible to say, unfortunately, but it really doesn't matter. China is now more or less united, not the whole landmass, but a good chunk of it, thriving and developing nicely. In Mesopotamia, it was a bit of a century of peace, mostly. Babylon, Sealand, Elam, and Assyria don't seem to have engaged in any major conflicts with each other for once, but Babylon is pretty much steadily declining, and the Hittites have risen to the north and now seem to be threatening as far south as the Mesopotamian heartland. Egypt is actually almost reunited under the Hyksos 15th dynasty, with only a probably vassalized remnant native 16th dynasty in Thebes, but not really thriving. The 4 and 15th dynasty has not probably been well received by the population, and maybe doesn't have much experience of organized state governance and bureaucracy. Things don't seem to be going brilliantly still. So as we enter the 1500s, the Hittites gather to invade Mesopotamia. The Hyksos struggle to maintain their grip on power. What will become of Babylon? Can the native rulers of Egypt reclaim their kingdom? Subscribe and tune in next time to find out.